Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another video. This is going to be an update on the forecast for today, Wednesday, May 8th, as we have a pretty potent severe weather event on tap for a large portion of the U.S. The SPC is now upgraded to a moderate risk, level 4 out of 5, in the red shaded region here. So from southwest Missouri eastward through southern Illinois, western Kentucky, and northern Tennessee. That does include places like Bowling Green, Kentucky, Nashville, Tennessee. You are under the gun for that greatest level 4 out of 5 threat. Large enhanced risk extends down into parts of Arkansas, eastern Oklahoma, northeast Texas toward the ArkLaTex area. And a large slight risk extends all the way to the eastern seaboard into the Carolinas and down into central Texas. So a broad swath, a broad portion of the country under the gun for a severe threat today. But the main severe threat is going to focus particularly in the orange and especially the red shaded regions you see here. All hazards are on the table for today, and all of them have the chance to be significant. Tornado threat is at a 10% hatched area there, coincident with that moderate risk from southwest Missouri eastward in through the moderate risk area, including places like Springfield, Missouri, Jefferson City, Champaign-Urbana, Evansville, Bowling Green, Nashville, Tennessee. In that greatest tornado threat today, could see a few strong tornadoes as well. 2 and 5% areas extending down to the southwest into west or eastern Texas into the ArkLaTex area, including Dallas-Fort Worth down to Waco, as well as Little Rock. Under the gun for a 5% tornado risk today. The farther southwest you go, the tornado risk does drop off a bit, but there still is the risk for a few tornadoes down there into that region. Large to very large hail, and if there is any good news today with this moderate risk, it is that the upgrade has not been for tornadoes. It's been for damaging wind and large hail. Large hail, we are at a 45% hatched large hail risk today, so we could see some large to giant hail, especially across this pink stippled corridor here within that moderate risk area. 30% and 15% hashed areas do extend well down to the southwest into Texas, so we could see some large to giant hail down there as well. But the greatest hail risk is going to be within the red and especially pink stippled regions there. Damaging wind also a threat. They have upgraded to a 45% hatched risk within the moderate risk area for some significant damaging winds, 80 plus mile an hour wind gusts possible with these storms today. So all in all, a very potent setup for today. Could see a widespread area under the gun for significant severe weather, including the threat for giant hail, significant damaging winds, and perhaps a strong tornado or two. So let's go ahead and dive right in here. This is what's going on right now. We've got some storms going on right now that have a severe threat with them this morning. Recording this right at about 9 a.m. Central Daylight Time. So you'll see this a little bit later. And the radar is going to look different by the time you see this video. But this is what's going on right now. We have a severe thunderstorm watch out here for this complex moving through central Missouri, west central Missouri as we speak. This is expected to kind of expand in coverage a little bit. And this will pose mainly a damaging wind and large hail risk as it goes through the morning. We go down here into Kentucky and Tennessee. This is another complex of storms that is continuing this morning, pushing down kind of to the east and propagating to the south. You can tell here on the leading edge of the line you see some new updraft development. That is indicative of convective outflow. So it does appear that this complex is producing some convective outflow here. And as this stuff weakens through the morning, this outflow is going to play a role in our afternoon rounds of severe storms later on. Wherever this outflow boundary sets up, could be a favored corridor for some enhanced low-level shear, as well as an increase in the overall severe threat along it. So for now, this is going to start pushing a little bit, continue pushing a little bit off to the south, but expecting this to retreat northward today as we have a surface low moving in from the east with nice southerly flow in the warm sector. So that should push this boundary to the north a little bit once this convection to the north of it subsides as we go through the late morning and early afternoon hours today. So again, where that outflow boundary sets up going to be critical, and we should see these storms continue through the morning, particularly this complex across Missouri. This is expected to increase in coverage and pose some low-end severe threat as it moves off to the east this morning. Then behind it is going to be our main rounds of severe weather with this particular setup today. So here's what's going on at 500 millibars here on the SPC mesoanalysis page. A broad closed low centered across the northern high plains there, Wyoming into South Dakota, with a broad belt of stronger flow associated with this trough. We see a little bit of a short wave here up into the Great Lakes region. That was associated with our severe threat yesterday, produced several tornadoes up there in the Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan vicinity. That has since moved on, and we're going to see another shortwave develop here in the flow. As you can already see, a little bit of a stronger jet streak there at the base of this closed low, moving through southern Colorado, northern New Mexico as we speak. This will begin to move off to the, or continue to move off to the east as we go into today, and pose some synoptic scale forcing element for this severe threat today. You can already see we have a little bit of a shortwave here in the flow that has initiated this storm activity across Missouri into Tennessee. So we have just many little ripples in the flow here contributing to storm development today, but this is going to be our main shortwave back in here associated with this jet streak. Going down to the surface, we see our surface low with the initial shortwave well off here to the north. Not going to be of note with our setup today, but we have had significant, maybe not significant, but we have had notable cyclogenesis here along the dryline boundary, dryline cold front boundary down here across these southern plains, Kansas into Oklahoma and Texas. Somewhat elongated, not really a tight surface low or deep surface low at this point, but it has managed to develop somewhat, and that will continue to move off to the northeast today and help shape our severe threat going into the afternoon hours today. 850 millibars, we see a somewhat of a low-level jet here across this region, 30 to 35, maybe 40 knots here from Missouri down to the south into Texas and the Gulf Coast states, but not a very broad plume of low-level jet. As this low-level cyclone continues to move off to the northeast, we should see some maintenance of the low-level jet here today into these regions where our moderate and enhanced risks are, especially with northward extent, as that will the strongest winds aloft will focus near the core of that low-level cyclone. Down to the south, we probably will see a decrease in low-level shear here going into the afternoon hours as the low-level jet kind of moves off to the northeast. And so we should see minimal low-level shear down here, and so we're going to have to rely more on storm interactions and boundary interactions here across parts of eastern Oklahoma, Arkansas, into the ArkLaTex to sustain any tornado threat with this activity. But down here, it looks like mostly a large hail and damaging wind risk. We'll go into that here a little bit more in just a second. Very moist air mass here at the surface today. This is our current surface observations. You can see kind of where this activity is ongoing right here across western Missouri. Winds have shifted out of the southeast here across western and central Missouri. Our surface low kind of extends down in here. You can see the wind shift across these areas here. Just a broad surface low, not really a tight, deep surface low at all. But out ahead of that, we have a very broad, very moisture-rich warm sector. You can see here dew points in the 70s across parts of Arkansas into Tennessee, down in, and even greater dew points down here into the Gulf Coast states. Dew points nearing 75 degrees here across parts of Texas and into Louisiana. So very, very rich moisture here, especially with southwestward extent. This will continue to creep northward here, but we already have upper 60s dew points across a wide region here into southern Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee. That will continue to shift north here a little bit as the warm front retreats north somewhat with the northeastward advance of the surface low and that southerly flow, and thanks to that southerly flow in the warm sector, helping to advect that rich moisture northward across the region. So very rich moisture here across this region, despite having a fairly weak low-level response, but we do still have somewhat of a surface low here along our dry line / cold front boundary. Speaking of that boundary, that looks to be somewhere in here. Clear temperature and wind shift across this boundary. So not going to move a whole lot off to the east today. We should see a little bit of an eastward advance of this warm sector, especially with northward extent. As the surface low moves off to the east, we should see an eastward advance of that. Down here across Texas into the Gulf Coast states, however, we still probably will not see a robust eastward advance of this boundary. So we should maintain a very broad warm sector for today and into tomorrow. Tomorrow there is an enhanced risk across north central and central Texas for a few supercells with a large hail threat. We'll talk about that at a later time. Want to focus on our potent severe weather threat for today in this video. Let's take a look at some morning soundings here. We'll start off with the Nashville sounding. And you can already see why we have storms ongoing. Robust instability, even surface-based instability at this point. 73 over 71 there at Nashville. Robust instability. Upwards of 2,000 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE there. So plenty of instability already ongoing at this point. That's why we're going to see a persistent severe threat through the morning with these storm complexes. Deep layer shear already at about 50 knots or so, with some low-level shear to speak of, about 150 meters squared per second squared effective storm relative helicity. Still a little bit on the low side, but we will see that increase today especially across portions near the aforementioned boundaries, the outflow boundary and the warm frontal zone that should be advancing a little bit off to the north today, setting up from Missouri eastward into Tennessee and Kentucky. So all in all, a favorable profile for robust severe weather already this morning. We go back to the southwest. Let's go to Little Rock here. 67 over 65, still plenty of instability here. A little bit of more capping with southwest extent, but very, very weak capping. So it's not going to take a lot of forcing to initiate storms in this environment later on. We're going to see pretty rapid storm initiation today, at least behind the morning round. The morning round may help stabilize the atmosphere for a little bit, especially across Missouri eastward, but behind that we should see rapid destabilization with the northward advance of rich low-level moisture and strong surface heating in the wake of the morning activity. Here's our current satellite, and you can see here's our activity across Missouri. Here's that activity across Tennessee and Kentucky. Already plenty of clearing off to the west and southwest of this activity, so we should not have a problem destabilizing the atmosphere behind these morning rounds for that main round of severe threat going into the afternoon. But again, here is our Little Rock sounding, plenty of instability, strong low-level shear. We had a tornadic supercell go through the Hot Springs, Arkansas area this morning, so there must have been a fairly favorable profile, and the Little Rock sounding from this morning appears to show the maintenance of that profile into the morning hours. Strong deep layer shear for supercells in excess of 50 knots with strong low-level shear, 200 plus meters square per second squared effective SRH. So already our environment is primed for severe storms. Just need a little bit of help, a little bit of surface heating to erode this cap with southwestern extent, and we'll have a widespread severe weather risk maintained through the afternoon. Here we are at Dallas-Fort Worth, a little bit more shallow moisture here. Our moist layer extends up to about 850 millibars there with a little bit more stout capping. So storms should hold off here until the later afternoon hours across this region. Going to need some convergence along the dry line boundary and some stronger surface heating down there to erode this cap. But that should happen pretty easily today. And our profiles, again, this is going to decrease with southern extent, so we should see minimal low-level shear here. And so that's going to be foster with this much instability already in place, 3,000 joules per kilogram mixed layer CAPE, only expected to increase into the afternoon. With limited low-level shear, that should maintain a large to giant hail threat with any supercells down here in the southern portion of the risk area. Let's take a look at some model data here. This is the 12Z NAM coming in as we speak here. Here is our 500 millibar closed low, meandering here across the central and northern high plains. Not going to move a whole lot off to the east today, just kind of meandering across the plains, but we will see that little bit of a jet streak move its way through the base of this trough into the Midwest, Mid-South region. So out ahead of that, we should have strong deep layer shear to support multiple rounds of organized convection. Going down to the surface, let's see how the surface pattern progresses here. So you can see here is our little elongated surface low across parts of the southern plains that will shift off to the northeast today. Not really any appreciable deepening of that surface low. And that is always something, kind of a general rule of thumb I've seen. Just it's more of an anecdotal rule of thumb, not really any scientifically backed evidence for this so much. But usually when there's not a strong focus for severe storms, that usually means you're going to get a lot of storms, and it's going to be very widespread coverage, very random coverage here. So I do suspect storm mode is going to be a little bit on the messy side today. Given that we don't really have a focus for severe storms, fairly weak capping within the warm sector should lead to a lot of storms to go. So we're going to have a fairly messy mode today. Lots of clustered activity, lots of linear segments, a few semi-discrete supercells possible, kind of this mixed mode environment. But overall, not a really strong focus for robust severe weather. So there's going to be a lot of storms producing a lot of severe weather across a lot of area. So that is going to lead to somewhat of a messier mode. Let's take a look at our moisture here. I'll zoom into our southern plains sector here. So here's our moisture. You can see where the frontal boundaries are at this point. Here's our warm front, the northward extent of the 60s dew points, dry line back in here across west central Texas into Oklahoma. Going to see a little bit of a shifting in those boundaries today, somewhat of an eastward advance of the warm sector and the warm front. So by 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time, warm front is in here. Convective outflow, we'll have to see where that convective outflow boundary ends up. Probably has a chance of merging with the warm front to become one kind of longer composite boundary. This could be our boundary in here. Actually, let's take a look at the surface winds, see if we can see that. And so we put our actual warm front up in here, which is pretty accurate, and we do see a wind shift down in here as well. So this could be our outflow boundary, or maybe a secondary warm front of some sort. I would suspect it's going to be that outflow boundary from the morning convection. So again, probably have multiple corridors here where we have enhanced low-level shear to support a higher tornado, locally higher tornado risk along the warm front and along this outflow boundary wherever it sets up. Down here to the south, you see not much here. Temperatures getting up into the 90s down here in Texas, so it's going to be a well-mixed boundary layer, but we will have very strong moisture down here. Dew points in the 70s to support a very, very moist atmosphere. Air should feel pretty sauna-like out here across parts of Texas and into eastern Oklahoma and Arkansas today, given temperatures up approaching 90 with dew points in the low to mid-70s. So speaking of our moisture, once again, we have all this purple, 70-plus dew points here. Very, very rich moisture over a broad warm sector. A lot of real estate for storms to work with, so this is going to be a long-duration severe threat with this activity. And again, we're going to have multiple rounds of activity given fairly weak capping in the warm sector and these little perturbations rotating through, especially up here within the northern portions of the risk area near that moderate risk. So let's take a few soundings here. I'll take a sounding here behind this morning convection somewhere in south central Missouri. I'll take one here kind of along the outflow boundary, perhaps western Kentucky, then one down here in the ArkLaTex region. So here we are up here, and you can see why we have that all hazards threat in play. Strong deep layer shear for supercells, 50 plus knots of bulk shear. Strong instability, 3,500 joules per kilogram mixed layer cape, 79 over 73 at the surface, so robust low level moisture here with strong instability through the deep layers of the atmosphere. Veering and strengthening winds with height in the low levels, leading to some hodograph curvature there, 200 plus meters squared per second squared effective storm relative helicity. And even though that might be, somewhat of a run-of-the-mill low-level shear type number, the strong instability should help compensate for that a little bit. So that is why we have that strong tornado threat today, particularly with any storms that can fire and track along these boundaries, the outflow boundary and the warm front, where we'll have enhanced low-level shear even greater than what is shown here. So all in all, very favorable look for severe weather. Could see some large to very large hail in the initial life cycle of these storms, as the low-level shear is a little bit weaker earlier on. We should see a large to very large hail threat materialize, and then the tornado threat will kind of ramp up going into the mid-afternoon hours today. Here we are down to the south here. This is actually right along the warm front or an outflow boundary in eastern Kentucky. Very strong low-level shear. You can see almost easterly winds at the surface near that boundary, just on the north side of that boundary probably. Quickly veering and strengthening up into southwesterly winds there about a kilometer off the surface. So very strong low-level shear here, upwards of 400 meters squared per second squared effective storm relative helicity with very strong instability, almost 4,000 joules per kilogram mixed layer cape, 78 over 75 at the surface. Strong low-level instability as well. Very fat cape in the low levels of the atmosphere. 0 to 3 kilometer cape in excess of 200 meters squared per second, or 200 joules per kilogram, excuse me. So this is certainly an environment that does favor strong tornadoes. Just going to have to maintain any semi-discrete activity in this environment. Again, I do think there's going to be a lot of storms, a lot of storm interactions, and so we could see a quick transition to more of a messy mode, but any more discrete supercells in this environment, and especially those that can track along the boundary, will have that greatest threat for a strong tornado or two, given this very high-end parameter space here. Down to the southwest, a little bit of a different story here. Cape is a little bit higher. Lots of instability here. 4,300 joules per kilogram mixed layer cape. 87 over 76 at the surface, assuming temperatures get up into the 90s there. That is a very thick, juicy, low-level atmosphere. Very strong instability in the deep layer with more limited low-level shear. You can see here not as much curvature in the low levels of the hodograph. Fairly straight-looking hodographs here. That combination of strong instability, weak low-level shear, likely will favor large to very large to giant hail with any more discrete supercells down here in the southern portions of the risk area. I do suspect that the storm mode may be a little bit more discrete down here, given a little bit less forcing with southern extent. You can see the main jet streak well up here across Oklahoma into Missouri. Much more of a glancing blow down here across northeast Texas, so we should see a bit more of a discrete supercell mode down here in Texas, given a little bit less forcing for ascent. Now up here, we'll draw in our boundaries. So here's our dry line boundary, warm front boundary, outflow boundary. So let's take a look at our storm mode here. So here's our plot of cape and shear vectors with the boundaries outlined here in pink. And so the factors that we have that are promoting a more messy mode, we have very little cap. our shear vectors are very much oriented along these boundaries, particularly along the northern portions of the risk area. So you can see the westerly shear vectors here with the west to east oriented boundaries. So that is going to allow for a lot of training convection along these boundaries. And so I do think the storm mode, especially up here across the moderate risk region, especially going to be fairly messy. Initially, probably we'll see some pockmarked semi-discrete supercells around here, but eventually we'll see with that limited capping, stronger forcing up here, and more boundary parallel shear vectors, going to be a fairly quick transition to more of a clustered mode. Some line segments, some semi-discrete supercells that can hold on will have that greatest all hazards, significant all hazards risk, including the tornado threat. But we should see more of a clustered mode, some line segments in here, and things might get pretty messy pretty fast. Down here to the south, as I said, weaker forcing across parts of eastern Oklahoma, Arkansas into the ArkLaTex region, and our shear vectors are definitely more perpendicular to our initiating boundary along the dry line there. So we should see a little bit more supercellular development down here across southern portions of the risk area. Again, with limited low-level shear, that would be more of a large to giant hail, and damaging wind risk, with some tornado risk apparent in any storms through favorable interactions with themselves or with any boundaries at play. So I think very messy up here to the north across the northern portions of the warm sector near these boundaries, with more isolated development down south into northeast Texas, where the forcing is a little bit weaker and our shear vectors are a little bit more perpendicular to the initiating boundary. So let's go ahead and this is going to be, first of all, before we take a look at any cams here, this is going to be a long duration threat, as we suspected. Going to have a lot of forcing over here in that warm sector, not going to be doing much throughout as we go into the evening. So we'll have multiple rounds of storms, probably more storms firing back here along the cold front / dry line well into the evening hours, and we'll have multiple rounds of severe storms traversing these areas for a long duration multi-round severe threat here, especially across northern portions of the risk area. So if you get hit by a storm today, don't think that is going to be it for today. You probably will see more storms later on. That's just kind of the nature of this setup, with a lot of storms expected in multiple rounds. And we can see that here in our convection-allowing models. This is a 12Z HRRR run. Has that convection across Tennessee and Kentucky, as well as in Missouri with this morning round of storms. We go forward into the afternoon. This convection, as you can see across Missouri, tends to increase in both coverage and intensity, posing mostly a damaging wind and large hail threat. This stuff out here across Tennessee and Kentucky moves quickly off to the east and dissipates a little bit. That will allow that outflow boundary to stall and retreat northward eventually across that Tennessee-Kentucky border area. And again, that will be a favored corridor for any more robust tornado threat, with storms that can track along that boundary. So here's that initial round. We see some additional development here early on. This is going to be out here ahead of the initial morning round. You see some storms developing there. Western Kentucky, southeast Missouri. This is at 18Z, 1 p.m. Some supercells in here that will have that they will pose that all hazards threat. And so we're going to have, again, just pockmarked convection across a widespread region here. So these storms will have that all hazards threat, tornado threat, damaging wind, and large hail threat as they track near that warm frontal and outflow boundary zone. And then we'll have additional storms develop behind this morning round across Missouri down into eastern Oklahoma. You see there, this is at 23Z, 6 p.m. Lots of storms here across Missouri in a secondary round. And you can see out here with our eastward cluster there. Cluster is an accurate word to describe this. The storm mode becomes very messy, a lot of storms in close proximity to one another, interacting with one another, forming more of a more line segment clustered type convection. And then we see the radar fill in back here to the southwest. I'll put it on the southern plains sector here so you can see the evolution of convection down here. So we see going into the late afternoon, given a little bit stronger capping down here, a little bit less forcing, we'll have convective initiation hold off into the mid to late afternoon hours down here along the dry line. But you see by 5 to 6 p.m., storms fire there across eastern Oklahoma into northeast Texas, some more semi-discrete supercells in here, some clusters as well. But very large instability, weaker low-level shear should foster a large hail threat with this activity as it moves across parts of the ArkLaTex tonight. All right, going into the evening hours, going into another model here, ARW model. So we'll start here in the southern sector since we're already on it. So we see here with our ARW model, we are going to have a very similar depiction to what the HRRR was showing. So we see here down to the south, convective initiation holds off until about 22 to 23 Z along the dry line. Some semi-discrete supercells in here, some clusters in here as well, with that large to very large hail threat. Could see an isolated supercell or two as far down here as the Texas Hill Country, down toward the Austin-Waco area. Could see an isolated supercell there, but weaker forcing is going to keep coverage very much isolated the farther south you go. Up here to the north, let's take a look at our main risk area here with this setup. Lots of convection here. Here's our morning round of storms. And we see a few storms here once again in the middle by early afternoon, and then just a lot of storms firing back here behind and kind of coincident with almost that early round across Missouri. Quick transition to a clustered linear mode here. Very messy convection. You can just see a lot of convection here. And it will eventually kind of propagate off to the south today into southern Tennessee, northern Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, into Louisiana, back into northeast Texas. That will pose mostly a damaging wind, maybe an embedded tornado or two going into the evening hours in those regions, but mostly our main severe threat going to be up here across the Ohio River Valley region, where things could get pretty messy pretty fast. NSSL WRF model. This will be the last cam we look at here. There's our morning round of storms. Just continues on through the day. Lots of storms fire up kind of in between, near the warm front, near the outflow boundary. We'll have that all hazards threat, and then additional development behind it here across parts of Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, down into northeast Texas, with kind of a little bit more of a semi-discrete supercell mode down there, posing that large hail and damaging wind risk before things congeal into a strong squall line moving across Tennessee, the Gulf Coast, northern Gulf Coast states tonight, with that damaging wind, maybe embedded tornado risk. So that's going to do it for this video today. A very potent, long-duration severe weather setup on our hands. I do think storm mode overall is going to hamper a greater risk. If we had a little bit more of a discrete supercell mode in play today, I think we would see a little bit higher severe threat. But given that we have multiple rounds of severe convection in this kind of strongly unstable, strongly sheared environment, both on the deep layer and in the low levels, SPC has opted to increase probabilities here to a moderate risk from southern Missouri eastward into southern Illinois, western Kentucky, northern Tennessee. Again, places like Cape Girardeau, Champaign-Urbana, Bowling Green, Kentucky, Nashville, Tennessee, in that greatest level 4 out of 5 moderate risk for today. Large enhanced risk area, folks in the orange shaded area need to prepare just as if they were in the moderate risk area. That extends over eastward into eastern Tennessee, southeast Kentucky, down and then into the ArkLaTex region, eastern Oklahoma, Arkansas, down into northeast Texas. Slight risk surrounding that as well, all the way to the Carolinas and down into central Texas. So a broad swath of severe threat for today, with that greatest risk in the orange and especially red shaded regions. Strong tornadoes on the table for today. Again, I think storm mode is going to preclude more of a robust, strong tornado risk, but we could see a couple strong tornadoes, especially with any more semi-discrete supercells tracking in the vicinity of the warm front and outflow boundaries here. That will be the greatest risk for that will be across parts of central and southern Missouri, eastward into southern Illinois, far southern Indiana, central to western Kentucky, and the northern half of Tennessee. So Springfield, Missouri, Jefferson City, Champaign-Urbana, St. Louis, Evansville, Indiana, Bowling Green, Kentucky, Nashville, Tennessee, in that 10% hash region with the threat for tornadoes, a few of which could be strong. 5% risk area extends down into east and northeast Texas, Dallas, Fort Worth, Waco, down to Austin, Shreveport, Little Rock, Memphis, Jackson, Tennessee, Louisville, all in the 5% risk area for today. The farther southwest you go, the weaker the low-level shear, so that should foster more of a large hail and damaging wind risk down with southwest extent, but any storm interactions, favorable storm interactions, storm-to-storm interactions, and storm-to-boundary interactions could yield a few tornadoes down here across this region, but the risk should be much lower than areas up here across that 10% hashed region. Damaging hail, also going to be a significant threat today. 45% hashed area along that warm frontal and outflow boundary zone. For any more discrete supercells, they will pose a risk for giant hail, possibly 2, 3, 4+ inches in diameter hail, with 15 and 30% hashed areas extending down into Texas for large to giant hail down there as well. Damaging wind going to be a risk as well, given so much convection quickly transitioning to a more clustered linear mode. The damaging wind risk will be high today. 45% hashed area along the warm front and outflow boundary from Missouri eastward into Kentucky and Tennessee. Strong damaging winds possible down to the southwest as well. Wouldn't be surprised to see this 30% hashed risk area extended southward, as we saw in our convection-allowing models. That squall line is pretty extensive and pretty strong, propagating to the south, going into the nighttime hours tonight. So would not be surprised to see this extended southward into northern Mississippi, northern Alabama, northern Georgia, to cover the risk for significant damaging winds within that squall line later on into the nighttime hours tonight. So an all hazards, potent all hazards risk on the table for today, especially if you are in the moderate risk. But if you are in any of these dark shaded regions, you need to be on alert for significant severe weather today in multiple rounds. As I said earlier, if you get affected by severe weather one time today, that does not mean you are done for the day. We're going to have multiple rounds of severe weather in this particular event. And so don't think you're done with. Keep your eyes to the skies, even if you've been hit by severe weather once already today. Keep those eyes to the skies. Keep your eye on your sources for weather information, and as you may be under the gun again at a later time. So folks in these colored regions here all need to be on alert for severe weather today, but particularly in these orange and especially the red shaded regions here where the SPC thinks the greatest threat for severe weather in multiple rounds is going to come today. So with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.